All right, so we got our wax ups to a somewhat contoured stage. I did the same thing on the lower as I did on the upper first quadrant. I made sure that both cases are removable, and I've scraped away some of the excess here as I did on the maxillary. So now we can further continue our contour. And I'm just going to simply round these off a little bit with my alcohol torch. I didn't do that. And a little bit on the lingual. And you can further contour this off the model if you wish. Doesn't always have to be on the model, because sometimes with the weight of the model and the articulation itself takes off the sense of what your instrument is doing. So you can try contouring it off the cast if you feel comfortable. Or place it back on the cast if this doesn't work for you. But try different ways. So now I'm using a bit of a different tool versus the Lacron carver. It's somewhat of a number 7 spatula, although it's a little bit smaller than your average number 7 spatula, and definitely a little bit bigger than a Lacron tool. So keep in mind, once again, there's a deeper depression into approximately than under the tooth itself. So we have a little concavity to identify the periphery roll and the gingival roll here. So we have a little depression in between the two, and an even bigger depression into approximately. Again, you got to be aware where you put pressure with your hands on the case. If you're not comfortable with this, you can certainly place it back on the model. That's fine too. So I'm going to fine-tune this a little bit more. Again, try not to have your interdental papilla too bulky, because it will act like a food trap. And try not to put too much pressure. Have more movement with your instrument than pressure itself. So you're moving it rather swiftly across the wax and eliminating some of the high spots. So I'm not trying to carve it all at once, but more of multiple movements of my instrument, trying to create that contour. Going back here, just scanning back and forth as I'm carving away to ensure that at least the margins are very uniformed, and eventually they have to be nice and sharp as I do my final carving. Work my way around. Be aware where you put pressure again with your fingers. Notice that I'm holding the case on the pallet and under the mounting. If you find yourself trying to carve a very small area and you find this instrument being a little bit too large, then get back to the Lecran and get inside that space. Very often you'll find that interproximately, even your Lecran carver is just way too big or way too wide. So often what I'll do, I'll twist it on its side and carve it this way, just to get in between, a little finer. So a lot of times I swap back and forth between these two. So I have these two handy. So depending the area that I'm working on, I might use this instrument or switch back to the Lecran carver. Again, a little distal inclination of the root forms that we're trying to create. Slight, doesn't have to be severe. So again, I'm using this instrument in here, but I'm not going perpendicular. I'm turning it over and trying to narrow the instrument just by twisting it so I can get interproximately a little closer. Want to maintain the peripheral roll established with the land area and create a nice transition to the gingival roll with a little depression in between the two, and an even bigger depression interproximately. So you're creating this illusion that there's a root under the tooth. Maybe get a little bit closer in here. And go back to my carver and notice that I'm approaching it at a very shallow angle to eliminate any possible food traps in here. I can certainly take this off and just cradle it in my hand. I think it makes it a little bit easier, and you might have a better feel of what the tip of the instrument is doing. Same thing on the other side, especially right in here, interproximally. This is a very difficult area to trim and polish smoothly after you invest it. So you really got to make a good effort here now to ensure that this is a very tapered or very much tapered to the tooth surface. Without exposing the edge of the tooth. So we want to stay slightly above the edge of the tooth. Okay. A little bit of wax remover. If you find that you've applied too much wax remover like I just did here, just take a fresh gauze and just wipe some of it, and just enough, because otherwise it'll make it really messy. So I'm going to take a little bit of wax remover to clean any possible residue of wax on the teeth. And take a clean gauze and wipe off the excess wax remover. Okay, from this point, we're getting a little bit closer now to our final contour. Just going to give it a gentle flame. And notice that I'm flaming approaching from the peripheral side, not this way, for now. A little bit here. And then you can turn it over and approach it from the other side in terms of the direction of your flame. So if we were to count the number of carvings and contouring, or festooning as we call it, that I've done to this case so far, it would be 2. Generally speaking, at least for me, I need 1 more. And I'm getting a little bit closer now to my final destination, so to speak, where I can do a little finer carving around the margins, clean up the anatomy a little bit around the facial surface, and give it a nice flame over, and that should do it. But I wouldn't do it at this point because the wax is relatively soft, because I just flamed it. And I flamed it for the simple reason to eliminate some of the striations on the wax, and also to give me a better idea how to carve it again. So the wax is not as hard as it should be, so I'm going to let that sit, and at this point I would move on to the lower and do the same thing to the lower, and then go back to the upper. So I'm kind of shuffling back and forth between the two to allow the wax to cool off, so I have a nice hard surface so I can carve back and contour. Alright, so on the next video I'll show you the final carving. So I'm going to continue to do a little more carving here, and if we were to compare the two, I think we can clearly see that the upper one looks a little cleaner than the lower, because I've only done 1 carving here. I've incorporated 2 here. So I need to do 1 more here, and then a final carving on the next video to show the final result.